مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين قل هو الله المالك الملك تؤتي الملك من تشاء وتنزع الملك ممن تشاء وتعز من تشاء وتذل من تشاء بيدك الخير إنك على كل شيء قدير. Introduction, I think that my name is sufficient, Giovanni, right? I think that my little son asked me this morning, having to do with the dynamics of our family, he said, Daddy, are you just only a teacher now? And I said, yeah, I'm just only a teacher now. He goes, no, I mean, are you still a student? And I'm like, yeah, I'm still a student. but I'm also a teacher, right? So I'm here speaking to you as a teacher and a student. I'd like to begin to say that I am not an expert on Malcolm X. I'm not an expert on Malcolm X, and I think that looking back at it, scratching my head around it, I think that I'm here due to a slip of the tongue. I think that Saad Omar and I were talking one time, Ustad Saad, and he said something along the lines of someone was talking about Malcolm X, and I think I looked at that person's complexion and at their linguistic background, and I said, wait, hold up. I said, what is their expertise on Malcolm X? What do they really know about Malcolm X, right? How have they framed Malcolm X through, the very, very particular Sunni conceptions of what Malcolm X is salvageable for, so on and so forth, right? What have they said about these aspects of Malcolm X? And I guess now that Saad was going to, think about Malcolm X and make this memorial, he must have remembered my slip of the tongue. Again, I was simply just making conversation and attempting to show that I'm a well-rounded individual, so on and so forth, and now I'm here, right? Like I told you, I'm not an expert on Malcolm X, so before I start talking to you about Malcolm X, I will tell you sort of like my more personal relationship with Malcolm X, right? I am a New Yorker, Hispanic kid from the 90s and 2000s, and really all of us had to get into Malcolm X in one way or another, right? I mean, very, very early on, classes that are raced and suddenly realize that their teachers, the judges, the police, and everyone in authority around them, save for their parents, are of a different ethnic group, a different ethnic background, different form of speaking, that we're already categorized as two different groups of people, that they have power over you, that they don't live around where you live, that they're bussed in or coming in from several neighborhoods away, that every time it snows they're not going to be here, you have no teachers around you, so on and so forth. This allows young kids, whether they were black or Hispanic or Native American or anyone else who felt themselves raised in the United States, to begin to look for heroes. And so as a young kid, and I'm talking young from 13 all the way to 20 something, you're out there looking for heroes. And Malcolm X was within my constellation of heroes. He was within the constellation, right? It was not only Malcolm X, right? And again, I have to wonder how it is that I first even heard Malcolm X. Right, so if we're talking, for example, KRS-One being the sanad, right, KRS-One being the person through whom I first saw him, portraying himself as Malcolm X in his album By Any Means Necessary, right? So this is one of the ways in which I was able to hear of this person and begin to ponder on this person, reflect on this person, and think about the possibilities. But again, he was one of many. So along with him are people, for example, like Fred Hampton, right? Or for example, like Huey Newton, or the Black Panthers, or the Macheteros, or Brown Power, or Red Power movements, or all of these movements which in the 90s again began to surface for us young kids through the music, right? Through the poetry that we heard, so on and so forth. In fact, probably the people that introduced me to Malcolm X were the Nation of Gods and Earths, or the 5%ers. Right? These are probably the first people that I began to hear all of these, various notions about who it is that the heroes that I needed at that moment. People that demonstrated a full humanity and spoke in manners in which I understood, right? Had authorities that I understood, so on and so forth, right? Two aspects I want to bring out of this, right? One is that, again, Malcolm X comes to me as a constellation, within a constellation of heroes, right? Two, that there are many other ways in which other people have received Malcolm X, right? There are many, many other ways in which we have suddenly learned about this person and began to actually attempt to appreciate that person, reflect on that person, attempt an embodiment of what it is that one saw when one heard that person speak or act or behave, so on and so forth. So again, my relationship to Malcolm X is not one of an expert. It's simply one of someone who made a slip of the tongue and now was asked to go back and look at his childhood hero. And again, when I say childhood, I'm extending it at least 10, 15 years, right? Into my 20s and, and into college years, where that meant participating in demonstrations and protests and, anti this and in favor of that and anti-war movements and so on and so forth. So what Saad actually forced me to do, which I'm quite thankful for, was again go back and look at someone who as a youth I sort of fell in love with their image. And again begin to contemplate who it is that this person was. And I have to confess to you that looking at Malcolm X, again going back and listening to his speeches and looking at various biographies, whether it's Cohn's biography or whether I'm grumbling looking at Manning Marable's biography or whether I'm looking at the autobiography, I suddenly started to think about these practices that in modernity became sort of thought to be wrong by revivalists. Practices like, for example, things like Tasawwur al-Sheikh or Fanafi Sheikh, right? But these practices that happened by groups, by Muslim groups, where they would sit around and simply contemplate their teacher. They would really just sit and think about the image of their teacher. Really just think about a picture of their teacher. And really the idea here was that this person himself or herself has eradicated so much of the rust that gets caught up in our hearts and enter the depth of the human possibility, that even just to contemplate on them might awaken the same feeling in us. It might awaken the same bodily movements, the same intuitions, the same possibilities, the possibility of the human being. And just giving that cursory look again at his life, I began really to think in terms of that, right? In terms of, wow, these things that I even myself find slightly strange, to sit and simply contemplate an individual. I caught myself really just contemplating Malcolm X without any particular content, right? Not looking at a particular speech or a particular word, but simply just his being, right? Many people speak about him, his smile, right? You hear about, you hear his speeches, and he is really like a tamed lion, right? Like a gentle lion, right? Again, they cut through so many lies and they cut through so many veils, but at all moments it is absolute composure. And what everyone who spoke with him that I heard over and over and over again was about his shyness and his smile when it was no longer time to bring out the sword, right? Again, his shyness and his smile, that I caught myself doing nothing but again being an admirer, looking at him in that way, right? So what Saad said to me, right, and this is why I think it had to do with my slip of the tongue, was I want you to talk about how it is that Muslims have misrepresented or utilized his image or attempted to appropriate his image simply to promote certain aspects of Islam, right? And I thought, okay, that is certainly a good topic. It's a topic which has been done over and over again, right? Which is why I'm not going to concentrate too much on it, right? I also thought about the concept of sainthood, right? Which obviously is that I thought that I have to speak about sainthood. I thought I have to speak about Musa alayhi salam and PHARAOH, right? And so perhaps beginning with the first topic, which I won't talk about, but I'll give to you for 2-3 minutes, is the question about how Muslims have gravitated towards Malcolm X because of his conversion to Sunnism. Because it allows us to pat ourselves on the back. I mean, this happened actually just 2 weeks ago that I was with a group of Muslims and an elder Desi gentleman was, trying to make dawah to my father, and he's like, Malcolm X. That's it. Right? Malcolm X, right? Now tell me about Malcolm X. I don't know. He's that dude, right? He converted to Sunni Islam. Right? So he's looking at my dad like, Malcolm X did it, he's famous, he was a non-Muslim, now it's your turn, right? So here is this idea that we're going to look at Malcolm X solely through that last moment of conversion, right? Or those singular moments when he says, either rightly or wrongly, or in perspective, I had never been able to sit with a white person in absolute brotherhood and sisterhood. And in Mecca I was able to. Right? So there we go and we say, look, you see, what Western civilization could not fix, what it in fact created, Islam fixes. How do we know? Malcolm X said so. It's a done deal. Right? The rest of Malcolm X can sort of be, right? The fact is that till the very, very, very end, Malcolm X is talking about African unity. He's talking about black unity. He is talking about Afrocentrism. Right? He's talking actually at various levels to different people. Right? Because he really has a tremendous dynamicity, right? So at the end, he creates, after he has left the Nation of Islam, he forges two organizations, right? Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and an organization which is strictly looking at the unity of African American peoples. And beyond this, he is someone that begins to realize that the struggle of the Caribbean, the struggle of the Brazilian, the struggle of the French black, the struggle of the English black, that all of these are the same singular struggle. Right? He's one of the people that actually begins to look prior to Stokely Carmichael, right? And prior to these later thinkers who are going to be looking at institutional racism. He's one of the first that you can see just institutional racism, a tremendous dissection of it. A beautiful understanding, the understanding that capitalism and racism were forged together. That they are a single dynamic unity. The fact that once we move beyond African peoples, and the capacity to retain this idea of black people, if not as an essence, then certainly as an essential strategy, as something which happened in history and continues to happen in history, right? So a social construction is there nonetheless. It has power nonetheless. Even beyond that, he begins to look at unity of all non-whites. And then even begins to include that, within that, unity of all whites who are ready to obliterate racialism, right? Or ready to self-reflect against racialism, right? So these are some of the things that I could speak about in terms of saying what are some of the things that we're missing, right? Because again, Malcolm X in the end believes that Sunni Islam and black nationalism need not oppose each other, right? And he says this over and over. This is a work on the February. This is just February, his speeches. February alone, every day. And continuously he will bring this up. Continuously he will say, I'm a Muslim, and this is the doctrine. However, I'm an American. I'm in America. And the system there works as such. As such, black cannot be erased, right? It need be tackled. It need be understood. The structure need be changed, right? So on and so forth. What I really want to talk about, however, right, is really this notion of if we're going to speak of Musa alayhi salam, and we're going to speak of Pharaoh, and we're going to speak of sainthood, this is the slight perspective that I wanted to give. This is not conclusive. Nothing is conclusive. This is just a thought. I thought, why not speak on who is Pharaoh? In other words, if we want to be amazed by Musa alayhi salam, let's speak about Pharaoh. If we want to know why we might consider Malcolm X a saint, or why we must consider Malcolm X a saint, let's look at who Herran was. Let's look at Pharaoh. Because once we see the largeness of Pharaoh, once we see almost the omnipresence of Pharaoh, the dynamics and power of Pharaoh, we might be able to see who it is that was able to speak truth to power. Who it is that was able to live the greatest jihad, as the Prophet ﷺ said, which was to be able to speak truth before a tyrant. And as many of you have heard over and over and over, why is this the greatest jihad? It means death. And it's a death which Malcolm X, much before his death, much before he was announcing in February and in January that he was a dead man walking, he announced it over and over and over. He said, I act and am existing as though I am a dead man. Right? Before this, he had already said it in many interviews where he said the only thing that is lacking is that no one is ready to take freedom. And they said, well, what does that entail? He said, your blood. He said, your blood. Right? That is what freedom entails. Right? And so if we want to know this sainthood, we need to look at Pharaoh. And we need to look at Pharaoh in a very large picture so that we can see the extent of Pharaoh. Because it might be that listening to Malcolm X, since so much of what he says has now become common parlance, we might begin to mistake his prowess, his fearlessness before PHARAOH, right? We might see dear white people, and now imagine that the every single day colloquialism of white supremacy and wokeness and all of these. Now that they've become common parlance, easy to roll off the tongue. Easy to roll off the tongue. We might forget what that meant when that meant death. And it did. When saying those things meant death. And so, who is Pharaoh? Right? Interestingly enough, Malcolm X made this analogy many times between Pharaoh and Moses. But he did not mention himself as Moses. Does anyone know who he mentioned as Moses? Can anyone imagine who he mentioned as Moses? Elijah Muhammad. Absolutely. Absolutely. Many times he mentioned this same analogy as you might know, the idea of living in the wilderness, so black Americans as 22 black Americans as lost sheep in the wilderness of America, so on and so forth, right? Analogies to the exile, to Pharaoh, so on and so forth, right? So again, if I want to try to give you a picture of who is Pharaoh, how do I begin that picture? We might begin, say for example, with Malcolm X's own life, but then we need to be able to move beyond Malcolm X's life, right? So we might say, for example, that we all know that Malcolm X's father, right, a follower of Marcus Garvey, was assassinated, right? What was his charge for being assassinated? He was an uppity nigger, right? And we all already know what that means, right? It simply means having the dignity to behave as a human before others, right? To be respected as a human before others. And that simply was not allowed. So we might say that as a child, to know that your father is assassinated, is either pushed or tied, right, or beaten and then thrown, right, before a cart, what is one of those called? The trolley. Trolley, right, a trolley. I mean, that already shows you the idea of Pharaoh itself, right? But then we move, right, we will move our myopic sight beyond Malcolm X, and they move, for example, to Elijah Muhammad, and Elijah Muhammad has in one of his works where he himself is talking about how as a child, as Elijah Poole in Georgia, he sees a black man be killed. He sees the execution of a black man. And he says in his memory, and what he remembers, is that he could not understand why it was that every other black man simply watched, did nothing, hid, right? And so now we begin to sort of see this concept of what Pharaoh was, right? Since it was far greater than Malcolm X, such that his teacher had lived the very, very same experience, very similar experience, right? So I'm going to delve back a couple, 200 years, 300 years, and I'm going to give you a thought about who this Pharaoh is, right? In the 16th century, Bartolomé de las Casas, right, debated another agent of the church named Sepulveda, and they debated for the very, very first time something which to me, as a historian, seems unprecedented. They debated whether Native Americans, right, this would be something along the lines of 150 million people, had a soul or did not have a soul. Right? So literally they sat down and they said, today we are going to have the decisive word on whether Native Americans, right, all of these Amerindian groups, whether they in fact have a soul or don't have a soul. Whether they are human or are not human. And frankly, again, as a historian, this seems to me unprecedented. I've never heard of it. Prior to this, there's certainly the idea that certain groups of humanity could become monstrous. And of course, when there is power, right, and there's the idea of othering, right, this monstrosity is obviously going to be distorted for the purpose of power, right? Well, those people over there, they're like this. Well, those people over there, I mean, Jews had horns in medieval Europe, right? Why did they use yarmulkes? Why did Jews use yarmulkes? To hide the horns, right? And this is written about, this is medieval, right? So, however, there is nonetheless the idea that humans have the capacity for change. As monstrous as they are, they have some capacity for change, right? In other words, monstrosity is an aspect of their self-development, right? They have become monsters. And as such, if they're willing to cease to be monsters and want to transform, they have that capacity, right? When Sepulveda and Bartolomé de las Casas first debate on whether the Native American or not has a soul, what they are now asking, what they are now looking into is the biologization of race, right? Is beginning to look at humans and say something completely different about them, right? First questioning, are they human or not? Are they human or not, right? Second of that, they are now saying, now that we have determined who they are, now we know their capacity in every way. Their aesthetic capacity, their intellectual capacity, their spiritual capacity. Now we know who they are. In fact, the modern conception of race really is that. It's the idea that once I am able to look at you from the outside, right? And by the way, by the 19th century, this literally becomes a science. It literally does, right? It's called either biometrics or phrenology or craniometry, right? And ultimately, it's a massive project to literally be able to quantify all of us. And then after the quantification and transforming that into certain mathematical, what is that called? A very, very simple word. You begin to do it already in like the 3rd, 4th grade with X's and equations. Thank you. Right? Turning it into a mathematical equation, talking about slopes of head, how thick noses are, how is basically all of these, right? Where we now begin to say that now there are capacities that go along with this, right? So again, what I'm talking about is, who is this pharaoh? And my first notion is that for the first time, you begin to have the idea of questioning whether someone is a human or not, right? After this, what emerges is going to be the institutionalization and the structuralization of genocide, right? What proceeds from this is going to be the death of about 100 million Native Americans. What proceeds from this is going to be, by the way, when Sepulveda and Bartolomé de las Casas create that debate, the debate is won by Bartolomé de las Casas, and they decide that Native Americans are nonetheless humans, right? Where then Bartolomé de las Casas says that there's only one answer now, which is to go into Africa and bring slaves. Right? And so Bartolomé de las Casas, who is usually championed as someone who still had the courage to move away from this new concept of sovereignty over other humans, right, and curtailing people's humanities, nonetheless, he then says, since Native Americans are human, right, and Sepulveda says they are not, at the very least what we can do is begin to bring over Africans, where there we have, again, a complete devastation of a socio-political, economic way of life. Again, if we're talking about the Americas, something along the lines of 100 million people, the numbers within the decimation of Africa through chattel slavery, through the Middle Passage, are again tremendous, right? They range anywhere again from 50 million to 100 million, right? Some people saying that there are at least 50 million people at the bottom of the ocean, so on and so forth. You guys already sort of have an idea of what this looks like and what this sounds like, right? Is anyone interested in having a 3-minute description of what slavery looked like, even though we have already been drilled, hopefully, into our heads, for example, what it is that the ships looked like, how many people were placed in the ships, what were the torture mechanisms used in order to be able to force feed people, right? What were the camps that were used to break in the person and to make sure that they understood their sub-personhood, right, and their domination, so on and so forth. Would anyone like to listen to a more apt description from an artist other than me?
Sure.
Okay.
One question for
yes,
that?
of course.
Just to understand, the debate between the two theologians determined that Native Americans were not subhuman, categorically speaking, but that the Africans, or which is many people, but people from the African subcontinent, because of the color of skin, were not considered human.
No.
Okay.
No. What basically, what I'm pointing to in terms of Bartolomé and Sepulveda is what they call a genealogical break, right? So for the first time, we begin to see just that questioning, right? Just that questioning, are they human? You remember it's Christians that are doing it, right? And the job of a Christian, or the supposed Christians that are doing it, and the job of a Christian is ultimately to go around seeking to save the soul, right? So by conversion into Christianity, right? Which would ultimately mean that your subjects have to have a soul. So this is the first time that Christianity is sort of put to the side and other considerations are brought at hand, right? What I would always like to say, that the consideration is, that the new dynamic is, that the new paradigm is simply sovereignty, human sovereignty. And what that turns out looking like historically is European sovereignty. And what that turns out looking historically is the sovereignty of a small group of European male elites, but which slowly begins to transform itself into the invention of whiteness, the invention of blackness, the invention of race, right? So I'm talking about the invention of these things for the very first time, right? The creation of whitehood, right? Which only becomes developed and concretized once you have what is not whitehood. And what is not whitehood is first, again, this conception of who are these people? What are these people, right? The interesting thing is that there's going to be a tremendous dynamic as time changes in terms of the sciences that are used to try to fortify, right, these policies. And they're going to say all sorts of things. So there are going to be groups of people that are going to say, you know what? There is no singular Genesis, right? There are multiple Genesis, right? Which means that ultimately Adam and Eve emerge out of whites, right? And all these other people, they must have a different species, right? Someone like Darwin says, no, actually we have a singular species. However, even within a singular species, there are, due to various transmutations, different stages of that species, different developments of that species. Right? And so probably by the late 19th century, the idea is really going to be that we are a stepping stone towards whiteness. That between the fact that Mark Crane looks different than me, looks different than you, right, is simply that we are moving, right, historically, right, biologically through various stages until you get to the utmost complexity, right, which is whiteness, right? So on and so forth, right? So my point again here, whether it is that they accepted Native Americans as humans or not, is just the very questioning. The audacity. How dare you ask whether I'm a human or not? I mean, take it like this, sister. Just to give you, this is a different example. Let's take Sarah Bartman, right? You all know Sarah Bartman, right? Sarah Bartman is known as the Venus, right? She basically is a Botswanan woman that gets brought over, right? Her dimensions appear to look different to whites, right? And so at first they put her in a freak show, in a circus, right? To be laughed at, looked at, giggled at, right? After she goes from that, she now goes into, she's basically thrown away after a few years of circus, and she moves towards prostitution, right? And by the way, this is very, very telling. This is very telling. People have already looked at the history of sexuality and colonization, sexuality and imperialism, and it's not absurd that she went from being something to be gawked at, something to be measured, right, to being a prostitute. Now, when she dies, the leading anatomist of the world at that moment, right? Have you guys ever seen those little trees of phylogenetic trees? You guys remember phylogenetic trees from when we were kids? You know, like a cat is related to this animal and that animal and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so Cuvier, who is the leading anatomist, he's actually, those phylogenetic trees are his. He's the one that made them up, right? He dissects her genitalia, right? I was forced to read 50 pages of dissection of genitalia. At the end, what does he say? He concludes, not human. This is what he concludes. He says her labia is closer to an orangutan. As such, she's not human. Why did he wait for her to die? Because clearly anyone would have known upon looking at her that she was a human. Because she spoke 4 languages and was known to run circles around the scientists that analyzed her. She was known to be very witty and really run circles around them. So Cuvier wasn't looking for a voice. Cuvier had already determined that there was nothing there to hear. Right? The only thing that he was looking for was measuring, prodding, controlling, right? So on and so forth. So what I'm talking about as who is Pharaoh, I'm trying to give this picture, right? Where now genocide becomes a structure, where rape becomes a structure. It becomes a structure. If I'm, for example, going to look at minute details where I look at Musa alayhi salam and look at Malcolm, I could easily say, loose analogy, I could easily say Musa alayhi salam brought into the house of the Pharaoh. What does that mean, right? Particularly when the Pharaoh in the Qur'an already knows that he's dangerous. He already knows that that is someone dangerous. It's one of the reasons why he gets brought into the house, right? Brought into the house so that perhaps he will not be dangerous. Perhaps he will be indoctrinated appropriately, right? Here, there's almost sort of like a brotherhood, right? Is it not Pharaoh that later, when he comes back to speak to him, he says, were you not an orphan? And I took you in, right? Actually, it becomes one of the languages, one of the things that white racialists are going to say to blacks, right? Were you not an orphan and I took you in, right? It's actually part and parcel of the eradication of this project, the eradication of history. You had no history. So one of the things Malcolm X is going to say over and over again, right? What is the idea of Africa in our minds? As a child, I completely concur with him. As a child, my idea of Africa was of naked people, right, jumping up and down around, a cauldron with two white people inside of it, ready to be devoured. Right? I mean, I've seen this. I've seen black and white TV shows were still playing in the 1990s. We would watch this, right? This is one of the things that Malcolm X says. And so I could easily say that in looking at this brotherhood, that, oh man, this is really telling. One of the scholars of structural racism says that when we look at whites and blacks in the United States, we're looking at a tale of siblings. Literally, we're looking at a tale of siblings, right? We're looking again at the institutionalization of rape as a mechanism of torture and domination. Which means, and then again, this is part of Malcolm's own life. Right? Who is his grandmother other than a rape victim? Who is his mother other than someone that understands that she is the result of a rape? Right? And so here there's already this idea. So when I'm saying let's look at Pharaoh, right? Let's look at Pharaoh, right? Let's begin to give this idea of who it is that Pharaoh was on a grand scale, right? On a grand scale, right? Such that being Malcolm was dangerous for Malcolm. Malcolm's death did not eradicate Pharaoh. This is the difference, right? Malcolm was telling us about something far grander. That with his death, it was not sufficient now to end what was occurring, right? And then going back again, to this sort of broad picture is the construction of race, right? The invention that there are multiple levels of human being, right? And again, the offset that this has after 400 years of indoctrination. After 400 years of indoctrination. So, if I could say a million more things on this, but if we're going to move from this, actually I was going to have you guys listen to, we'll hear it afterwards, to Brother Ali. I was going to have you listen to Brother Ali, Travelers, which every time I taught that race and history, race and poverty in America, whenever it was time to speak of slavery, I think he has one of the most brilliant pictures trying to demonstrate, what it is that slavery did to this tremendous segment of our history, right? Almost at the end of Malcolm's death, in February, he has an interview. It's a debate, right? It's a debate. Now, let's say I already said who is Pharaoh. Let's say that was sufficient for you. Now we're going to look at, who is Musa alayhi salam, right? That he is confronted with Pharaoh, right? Who is Malcolm X, right? That we are claiming that he is like Musa, that we are claiming sainthood, right? So he has a debate with two other people. One person who has already left the Nation of Islam, right, and preceded him in leaving the Nation of Islam, and is on the show as a representative of someone who is going to unveil the Nation of Islam, sort of what Malcolm X is doing at that very last month, right? Whenever it is that people are asking him about the Nation of Islam, about Elijah Muhammad, about some of the things that occurred, right? And someone who knows about black extremism and black nationalism, a scholar on black nationalism. And they bring them together and they debate for about an hour. And then they begin to have callers call in, right? Now, what's really, really interesting is that you get caller after caller after caller after caller on this 1 hour debate, and no one speaks about anyone except Malcolm. Imagine you're three people debating, right? Like you're here, like I'm so important, I'm a scholar, right? Like I know about black extremism, they called me in here to speak about it. This other guy actually says in the middle of the show, he's like, I left before Malcolm. So they should say that Malcolm is a follower of me and not me a follower of him. And then in begin the callers, and you can see who the callers are. Some of them are so ridiculously articulate, and they're already ready to attack Malcolm, that you say, oh, okay, so is that FBI, right? Or, I mean, what scholar have they concocted to bring up these arguments against Malcolm, right? And then one after the other, attacking Malcolm from every angle, and then Malcolm really just unsheathing his sword in such a tremendously beautiful way. Anyone who's ever heard, I mean, you see, really, Malcolm, if we're going to talk to him about being a saint, one aspect of him was his rationality. He's not really a mystic like Muhammad Ali, right? He is really just has this tremendous logic, right? This clear-cut logic and argumentation where he breaks apart arguments through analogy, right? Through logic itself and analogy, and his analogies are always so beautiful and poignant. But anyway, from amongst these people, a couple of people call in and they're like, Malcolm, we really respect you, so on and so forth. And then this one lady calls in. She calls in and she says, I want to speak to Malcolm. They say, okay, you can. Yes, is this Malcolm? Yes, this is Malcolm. She says, first I want to say, and then she makes a dua for Malcolm. She makes a beautiful dua for Malcolm. Right? Probably Christian. She didn't say Brother Malcolm. She didn't say Minister Malcolm, right? She makes a beautiful dua for Malcolm, saying that she hopes that Allah grants him everything that he is seeking and success. Right? Which I believe that dua was answered. Right? I believe that dua was answered, and I've already moved beyond the years when Malcolm had already died. Right? I'm older than Malcolm after he died. Right? And I want to live. Right? I want to get all the way to, but I believe that her dua was already answered. And then she says, I want to say thank you. And then he says, you're welcome. And then she says, very, very simple. She says, Mr. Malcolm, I really want to say thank you. Because of you, these children are actually glad to be black. And then that's it. Now again, multiple experts, no one speaks to them. Everyone that calls in is actually some scholar waiting to tear apart Malcolm's arguments. And then the woman calls in, makes a dua, and says, because of you, blackness is something that one can still have pride in. Because of you, the children are not afraid. They're actually glad to be black. Now, how is that like Musa alayhi salam? If we're going to say that PHARAOH had the capacity for hundreds of years of thorough indoctrination, that by the end of it, there are libraries filled worth of anatomical, biological, sociological, anthropological, scientific evidence there to show that whites are superior and that everyone else is inferior, right? To the point where this has actually begun to enter the minds of those that are subjugated. And I will prove it to you right now. I'll prove it to you that it is beyond Malcolm's moment. What Malcolm says in one of his speeches is he says, who taught you to hate? Right? When they actually say, you're full of hatred. He says, who taught you to hate the color of your skin? Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the dimension of your nose, the girth of your nose and your lips? And then beyond that, who told you to hate your history? Who told you to hate anything which brings you back to anything which you were remotely in ancestry? Right? This really has not changed. If you want me to simply bring it out, flat out there, it has not changed. In India today, one of the most rising stars, if you want to invest, right, amongst companies, a country where economically continues to see economic collapse, is Fair and Lovely. 2 years ago, it rose by 14%. Astronomical. astronomical. I don't think that there's anyone here that doesn't know what fair and lovely is. If you're Egyptian, you might have seen it as be white. Right? That's the Egyptian version, be white.
It's very lovely.
It's also... Well, I'm sorry. Be white is the knockoff. Fair and lovely still stands, right? And for in case you guys don't know what be white is, right? It's just, it burns your skin. Don't use it for too long because you'll begin to bleed. It burns your skin. Does it not? You have 7 layers of skin, each one lighter than the other, right? Now, you want to be lighter? Begin to burn off your skin. This is really a phenomenon which is worldwide. This is a worldwide phenomenon. This is a cream, right, which literally is one of the rising economic stars. One of the rising economic stars. I mean, you want to know how much it is that we have begun to hate our dimensions and our skin colors? Look at Desi Brides. I'm sorry. Look at Desi Brides. If you want me to point to Hispanics, I could easily point to Hispanics, and I know that Sister Hazel will back me up 100%. In Latin America, where we are literally a mix, where the brother is black and the grandmother is white, and we have really everything, right? Even amongst us, our language has changed. When we say blanco, which means white, we elongate it. When we're going to describe her, who's about to marry him, you say, es blanc. We do. You want to say Native American, we make the diminutive. Little Indian. Ese indiecito. Right? You want to talk about blacks, it depends whether you're making up the lie that they robbed you, and there was many of them, or you are not. If you're not, then it's negrito. Little black man, right? Boy, right? What Malcolm X says, he says, you could be 50 years old and you're still called boy. You're still somebody's boy. Right? In Latin America, despite the fact that your brother's black, that your uncle's black, right? If you want to diminutize it, that little black man, ese negrito. If you want to talk violence or something, ese negrote, right? Suddenly it becomes like this monstrous body, right? There's this monstrous body which takes up space and violence, right? And this is not only a thing of Latin America and of India, right? This is really not only that. I mean, have you guys seen the Fair and Lovely commercials? That's rather interesting, aren't they? Oh, there's so many. There's one in Indonesia that basically says that if you don't want to be beaten by your husband, Fair and Lovely. Fair and Lovely. So again, you want to ask the question of what is it that Malcolm did? She answered it there. For the first time in history, this is not a lie. This is not a lie, right? White imperialism, American imperialism, Western imperialism, modernity had demonstrated itself so powerfully that when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, brown nations were astonished. They couldn't believe it. They had begun to believe that whites were invincible. This is historical. They had begun to believe that whites were invincible. We had begun to believe that we needed to interpret our deen completely and solely through the idea of white Western modernity. No matter how much we respect Iqbal, you want to read Reconstruction of Religion, right? You're going to see that one of the things that he does in it, read it please. I was enamored by it as a youth. And afterwards I critiqued it tremendously. Is he says, well, modernity is where we should be at. Like here, what the West did, that's the point of reality. We didn't make it there. Why didn't we? And he goes back in Muslim history and he says, well, we could have. We should have. Right? The technology, the power, the imperialism. That was supposed to be us. Right? We began to go back and reinterpret our whole history in terms of why didn't we make it there? Right? Of course, we forgot to mention all the other aspects of there. Environmental disaster. Control over other humans. Denying other humans humanity. Right? Destruction of their educational systems. Right? The case is such that Charles Mills, who wrote a brilliant work that I want everyone to read, called The Racial Contract, he calls it epistemology of forgetfulness. He says one of the main things that Western imperialism did was, how do we forget? As whites do we forget that there was anybody here? Right? That there was anybody here. And that's not a joke. that means that when we look at their censuses, that means that when we look at how it is that they counted who was in the Americas, they count by 1/10. They count by 1/10. So they say there was only 100,000 people there. And now we got people looking back and saying, no, there was at least 1 million there. There was only 10 million. No, there was at least 100 million. The idea, of course, is that you entered upon a virgin land and there was nothing there but animals. In fact, the language began to change, right? Human in the state of nature, which is the same thing as human in the stage of war, right? Homo silvestris, savage, barbarian, right? To the point that we ourselves began to believe that we were savage and barbarian. Right? We ourselves began to believe that the ways of dressing, ways of thinking, ways of acting, complete histories, ancestry were vacuous. Right? They had nothing to offer. Right? And so when Musa alayhi salam, before Pharaoh, the Qur'an tells us what happens. They threw. The magicians threw. And placed a spell over the people's over the people's eyes, and the people were filled with terror. This is exactly what happened. And this is what Malcolm came to do. He came to throw. And when he threw, it destroyed those lives. One of the first aspects. To us, it may seem the idea of you're black, but you're human. And you are as capable intellectually, morally, spiritually. It may seem to us as though, obvious, right? You are black, or you are desi, or you are brown, but you're aesthetically pleasing. It may sound to us as though that's strange. It's actually not. Other than mathematics, other than measuring slopes of heads, which, by the way, they got it all wrong. If you really you read Thomas Huxley, for example, and you read the description, Mark, it's absurd. It's absurd. It really has our jaws. It really has the slope of our heads. It really has our heads small. It really has me unable to move my arms. I'm talking Thomas Huxley said something along the lines of the non-white man, and the closer you get to black, has an inability to move his arms, his shoulders, right, back and forth. He only moves them forward, right? He only has them forward, right? And his arms are longer than his legs, right? And his jaw is larger according to his movement away from animality. And I could give you the amount of works which wrote about this, right? Interestingly enough, in comes Gobineau with his work, The Inequality of the Human Races, where he says, you know what? There's so many stages and races that have been outlined, right? I mean, as Hispanics, we already know those. The mulatto and pardo and mestizo and, paso atrás and octoroon, and you're almost there. And you don't worry about it, right? And you don't marry that one. You're just going to be going backwards, right? We know all of those multiple stages, right? Gobineau said that in the end, Miner had it correct when he said there's only two races. The beautiful race and the ugly race. So Charles Mills says that alongside with all of these quantifications, there was just the idea of aesthetics. There was just the idea of, oh yeah, there's the slope, and here's the carriage, and here's the percentage, but they're just ugly. And we're just beautiful. And of course, that added to everything else. They're just spiritually ugly, and we're just beautiful. They're just morally ugly, and we're just beautiful. They're just intellectually ugly, and we're just beautiful. So in comes Malcolm. They put the wool over our eyes, mystify our eyes with speeches of blanco and indiecito and negrito, and you better bleach your skin, and too bad, oh well, at least your sister, man, look at that skin color, she can marry a doctor, right? You're smart, right? You're a smart girl. So you didn't get the skin color, so you might as well. Here he comes and says, who lied to you? Who told you to hate your capacity? Who told you to hate your carriage? Who told you to hate? I mean, this to me, right, once we begin to look at the scope of who Pharaoh was, to the point where he had the capacity to make us envision ourselves as inferior. It continues. Sherman Jackson, not too long ago, gave a speech, Dr. Sherman Jackson, called White Supremacy. Is it the beginning of modern shirk? White supremacy, the beginning of modern shirk, right? And there, he just basically follows what racial theorists have been saying for a very long time, that the construction of whiteness, right, the invention of whiteness, and you know that it's invented. You know that the word begins to be used at a certain moment. And we're still debating of how it's used. Some of us say it begins in Latin America, right? Where for example, the criollo, the Creole, meaning the white person, the European born in Latin America, is no longer peninsular. He's no longer a Spaniard, right? And so he's like, but I'm something, right? Like, I'm not like them, right? I'm white, right? Or some people say that it begins in the United States, right? Through the concept of slavery, through the idea of these blacks, they're Christian, we forced them to be Christian, and we were Christian before, that's what our title was, Christian. Damn, we can't be the same, right? We need to create another category, right? So the invention of whiteness, right? And so here, this invention of whiteness that slowly begins to creep up into our language, right? So here, Sherman Jackson says, following racial theorists, that the invention of whiteness is simply making one group, right, normative, what it means to be human, right? Their opinions are right, right? You're either a liberal or you're a savage, right? Here's where civilization is, right? What's the alternative, right? Here are the saviors, right? What were we doing before? Who were we before, right? You don't want to go back to Pakistan, right? You don't even want to go to today's Pakistan back, right? You get all these young girls saying, I'm not marrying someone from Pakistan, they're backwards, right? I mean, but that's Pakistan Americanized already, right? That's Pakistan already westernized. That's Pakistan already fair and lovelized, right? And already you're saying, I don't, right? So what are you saying about the past, right? So here comes Malcolm X and says, this is all a veil. This is all a veil. And you listen to his speeches and it moves from that depth. It's not only about the idea of you are human, you have beauty, you have potential, you have capacity. He then goes, as I said before, into those really small dynamics, tremendous dynamics, right? Again, as I said before, re-looking at the legacy of Malcolm X and his speeches, I look at institutional racism and structural racism as a theory, and I say he was the first theorizer. I really do, right? I look at what later was written by Stokely Carmichael, and I say, well, you got it from Malcolm X, right? Tremendous, right? One of the things that I wanted to point out, hopefully I'll point out a couple more things before we're done. I think it's a year before Malcolm X is assassinated, Medgar Evers is assassinated. Then 2 Black Panthers are assassinated, right? Fred Hampton being one of them, assassinated in his home, right, on his bed, while sleeping next to his wife and child, right? What you have afterwards is just a continuous ring of assassinations of black leaders, right? The assassination of Malcolm, simply because we are Sunni and he was Sunni and it resonates with us, right? It's not the sole purview of who Malcolm was, right? Malcolm understood this. In 65, he gets asked about the year. What are the prospects for this year? And he says, this is going to be the bloodiest year in the Black American Revolution. This is going to be the bloodiest year, right? Amidst him is KKK and KKK activity, right? Amidst him is prisoner leasing, right? So does anyone here know what prisoner leasing is? Just to continue with the idea of who is PHARAOH? Okay, so very, very quickly. So blacks are emancipated, right? Now it's all good, right? Now everything is wonderful. Yes? Well, there's a couple of years of what they call the nadir of Black America, or the Reconstruction, where we actually begin to see what black communities do on their own, right? And what we begin to see is businesses, right? The participation in the public, participation in politics, so on and so forth. And then we begin to see the reinstatement of racial hierarchies and of racial akhlaq, right? Racial akhlaq, right? In other words, as a slave, don't you dare look at me, boy, right? Now you're free and I need you to understand, don't you dare look at me, boy, right? Even though things have changed, right? And so the language now begins to change, right? And the institutions begin to change. But what they do is ultimately the same. So 2 institutions emerge out of this. We've all heard of Jim Crow, right? And all of the various laws which emerge out of this, right? The other one, very, very important, is lynching. is lynching. This is now institutionalized, right? And we've all seen the pictures, we've all seen the little kids smiling, right? While the black man is being burnt slowly, right? What they call a southern barbecue, right? So on and so forth. We see the pictures being taken. We see people in their Sunday best, so on and so forth. The other thing was called prisoner leasing. Very, very simple. All you need to do is criminalize. And by the way, again, Malcolm X is amazing at being able to dissect this. He actually does it very, very well. You criminalize a population. You create the idea that this population by nature is criminal, right? We've already done this through biology, right? And just through continuous interaction, right? And now that they are criminal, you go out and you catch the criminal, right? Interestingly enough, what the researchers have demonstrated is that depending on industry's desire for worker prisoners, that's how many blacks were arrested and that's how many blacks were put into jail. You get me? So there's a rising industry, we need 2,000 workers, right? Time to go arrest some blacks, right? And when we look at the charges are sometimes just ridiculous, just absurd, right? And interestingly enough, or oddly enough, what we realize when we look at the statistics is that you sort of want to keep your slave alive, particularly if you're a small slave owner. And most Americans were, unlike, for example, Haiti, like the French and the Spanish, with tremendously large plantations, right? I mean, we're talking about in the thousands and thousands of slaves working for a single plantation, right? But if you're in America, and there, the life cycle moves fairly quickly. You probably are going to live about 10 years as a slave. But in the United States, you want to be able to keep the slave alive. They're expensive. Prisoner leasing eliminates that. To the point where we know now that of the people that were arrested and forced to work in bourgeois economies, like for example coal mining, 30% of them were dead within a year. 30% of them were dead within a year, right? And it's a complete system of being able to keep people jailed indefinitely, right? So on and so forth. You want to read on it? Read a work by Blackman called Slavery by Another Name. Slavery by Another Name, right? My last point there is that Malcolm X's legacy of waging struggle against PHARAOH did not die with him. And he was very, very acutely aware of this. Tremendously acutely aware of this, right? And we could speak, for example, today about mass incarceration, which I imagine that you guys also know about, right? Mass incarceration, very, very, very simple, right? Very simple, right? Again, civil rights emerges, right? So now all of these laws which we had instituted, such as prisoner, 20 years, the United States goes from having 200,000 prisoners to 2 million prisoners, right? Today it's something along the lines of 3 million prisoners. 85% of those prisoners are black and Hispanic. 85% of those prisoners are there for non-violent drug possession. Non-violent drug possession. And we could continue again and talk about this for another hour or 2 hours. The idea is that the whole concept of PHARAOH does not cease to end. It does not cease to end, and I could tell you many, many works that you can read on this. I'll give you 2 works to read on this. You want to, for example, look at the idea of the different worth of lives, whether they are white or non-white. Look at Talal Asad's work on suicide bombing. It's called On Suicide Bombing. Ultimately, what the work does is simply demonstrate how this continues to live on, and all the dirty wars which are occurring today, all the multiple struggles which are occurring today, right, which are claiming the lives of really, literally millions of people. What is it that race has to do with that, right? How is it that race is implicated in that? So on and so forth. Sister Ajiha is, I just want to know how many minutes I have left.
She just stepped out.
She just stepped out? Okay, I'll continue, and I think, you know what, I got about five minutes left of me talking, right? You don't want to hear someone talk for way too long, it gets ridiculous, right? Okay, I don't think I wrote what I was going to say. Two last things that I wanted to talk about, right? One of the things that Malcolm can help us with today. I know that you guys are attuned to the debates and arguments which are occurring today between scholars and activists. Yes? Raise your hand if you have heard of some of these struggles which are occurring between scholars and activists.
Within the Muslim community?
Within the Muslim community, right? Just struggles, right? So can anyone tell me what some of these problems are? Hazel, can you tell me what some of these little debates,
Sure.
tidbits and...
One would be that we live in a raceless society, and that we need to learn how to just be Muslim in order to move things forward.
Okay. So again, I'll translate this. I'll add some. So I guess the idea. And by the way, this actually happens. You guys know Tariq Ramadan, yes? You guys know Tariq Ramadan's grandfather. Yes. Tariq Ramadan's grandfather interviews Malcolm X February, right? Malcolm X finishes writing the answers to the interview the day before he gets murdered, right? The 20th, and he sends them in to Al Muslimun, which is at the moment a journal which is being written in Belgium, where Tariq Ramadan's grandfather is, right? And one of the things that Tariq Ramadan's grandfather says is precisely this, Hazel. He says, am I to believe that you, even though you have left Elijah Muhammad, still think that black skin color is a factor, right? I would not imagine that someone as intellectual, as spiritually developed as you would see would imagine this and not realize that Islam has already brought the answer, right? So already the idea here is that all we have to do to be able to move beyond a racialized society where we imagine that there are various distinctions between us, distinctions which speak about our morality, our capacity, so on and so forth. All we have to do is practice Islam as it was practiced before. Right? And Malcolm X goes then on to respond to this, right? And Malcolm X says, I'm sorry, right? This is just not the way that it works, right? Here's some things, for example, that Malcolm X did not know, which we know today, right? We can find a lot of colorism in a lot of our fiqh works, right? I can go to you and give you an 18th century, it's not racialism, it's mildly different. It really is, right? But I can find you a scholar of fiqh, a Maliki scholar of fiqh, that tells me that I cannot look at a white woman, but I can look at a black woman, because I'm not interested in her anyway. She's black. I can show that to you, right? So these are going to be some of the arguments, right? I think that Malcolm X, in terms, for example, of the divide which we see, the idea of intellect and practice, he really collapses them into a single one, without fissure. Without fissure. If you were speaking about intellectual capacity, Malcolm X really is amazing. Malcolm X is a scholar. If you were speaking about spiritual fortuity, I mean, he had been practicing zuhd already under the Nation of Islam for over 2 decades. And this is really someone that is, for over a decade, sorry. For 15 years he had been practicing zuhd. This is someone who has really abnegated from himself the joys and the pleasures of this life, right? One of his last interviews, he says, I've learned to live within my means. By which then he expounds is that I have nothing, by the way. Right? I have nothing, right? I have nothing, right? So if you want to talk about zuhd, intellectual prowess, but then if you want to talk about practice, the older metaphysicians, the pre-modern metaphysicians used to say that there were various ways of traveling to Allah, right? William Shidduch, the contemporary scholar of Ibn Arabi, speaking about Ibn Arabi, says something very, very beautiful. He says, life is traveling from the real, to the real, through the real, right? Our life, and as you know, the real is just Ibn Arabi's way of saying Allah. Al-Haq, right? So he says life is a travel from God, to God, through God, right? Through God. That means that we are never, ever, ever away from our Lord, right? The way that Ali radiallahu anhu put it is I have never seen anything that I did not conceive of Allah before it, right? Beneath it, above it, right? That means that in everything, Allah has His two hands involved in that affair, right? And so the metaphysicians used to say that one of the ways to travel to Allah is through creation. It's through creation. And this is one of the things that Malcolm X, even though I am saying that there is no fissure in Malcolm X, there is not this division of the activists and the scholar, right? One who puts into practice morality and ihsan, right? This is some of the things that the scholars are saying to the activists. They're saying, we have no trust in your self-transformation. To us, it seems that knowledge for you is not embodied, right? A lot of it is discourse, right? If I use this discourse, then I'm okay with it. If I know how to use this type of discourse that I do not confront anyone in certain ways and their rights, then I'm not trying to depreciate the value of the activist. I'm simply saying what some of the scholars are saying, right? In Malcolm X, you don't notice that fissure, right? The zuhd, right? Meaning the embodied morality, right? The embodied morality, right? The practice of prayer, the practice of lowering the gaze, the practice of everything which is ibadah, right? As well as the practice of the intellect, not only in terms of knowing your Lord, but knowing the surroundings around you, right? There is no fissure in Malcolm X, right? As well as understanding that he is here to find his Lord through us, through awakening us, through making sure that that child is proud to be black, realizes that they are a human, right? As Malcolm X said in his last speeches, when confronted with this idea of Islam and black power, he said he really speaks on the idea of not until we realize that we're human, that we realize that we have dignity, then can we, right? So he says the Muslim mosque, this is to teach people how to live. But African American unity, this is to teach them that they're human, right? And you can't begin to reach ihsan until you know that you have the capacity to reach ihsan, right? So first we must destroy this idea, for example, today, that you're a thug from the block, right? I'll tell you a secret. My daughter's here. When I was a little kid, my dream as a little boy was to be a thug. Was to be a thug, right? And I was actually discussing this with my wife. She told me that, she said, you know what? You've been telling me you're the streets for years. And I said, I was joking, right? I was never the streets. I'll tell you what though, I pretended to be for 2 years. And it was pretty believable, right? It was pretty believable. Really, it was part of our, right? Really. I mean, one of my early heroes when we're talking about Malcolm X was Cypress Hills, the rap group. For a variety of reasons. With their main song, Here's Something You Can't Understand. How I could just kill a man, right? You know, this is really, and by the way, I respect Cypress Hills. And I respect that song. Right? That song has some interest to me still, right? But here's some of the things that Malcolm X now first wanted to disengage you from. You cannot reach ihsan until you have reached this. So here again, Malcolm X, an amazing totality. Really reminds me of what Tabari says in terms of the Sahaba, where he says that they were monks by day and horsemen by night. No, the reverse. Yeah. Horsemen by day, right? Soldiers by day, right? In the struggle by day to transform this, to make sure that this does not stay like this. And monks by night. They saw no fissure. There was no fissure, right? Their uprightness, right? Their detail in the ibadah had nothing to do with the idea, or did not conflict in any way with the idea that things must be transformed, that we are here for things to be transformed, right? In fact, this is one of the du'as which Malcolm X makes. I believe it's in London. I believe it's in London, in the London School of Economics. This is a few days before his death. And he makes a du'a for everyone there. And his du'a, I don't remember it verbatim, but really it's along the lines of, one, that Allah make you understand that you have success in everything you do. 2, and I'll read it to you later if you want. I have it written down. 2, Malcolm X dua for the people there. 1, that Allah give you success in all your endeavors. 2, that you realize your place in this world, where you fit in it, and what you have to do. What you call the life of intentionality. that you realize where you are and what your job is. 3, that you have no fear. That Allah take away from you all the fears which are in your heart. Right? That was the 3rd one. And here's the last thing. The first one, that Allah give you success in everything that you do. Right? Here and in the akhirah. Right? 2, that you realize your place, your position, and what you have to do. So you realize as an instrument of God what you're here for. Right? That you have intention in your being. And 3, that Allah take away all fear from you. And here is where I want to end with the idea of Malcolm as a saint. Right? Now, in our tradition, there have been 2 approaches to learning God, to knowing God. One is through words, through the tongue, right? It's what the mutakallimun did, right? They would basically, write down, conceptions about like atoms moving and why atoms had always to be moving, and from there they would try to prove God's existence, right? They basically wagged their tongue, right? Now Ghazali says in his work, Munkidh min ad-Dalala, he says that all they did was just be masters of statements, right? They knew how to make really, really cute arguments, right? The other approach to knowledge of God has always been the experiential approach, right? The experiential approach. How do you know God? You experience God. And how do you experience God? You experience God through your being. You're already experiencing God through the utmost capacity of your being, right? To the degree that you can experience God, you are already experiencing God. But I want to experience God more. So the tradition and the tradition of sainthood and the tradition of self-transformation has said you do this through various practices where you move towards self-abnegation, right? Some people call this futuwa, right? Now futuwa, what it means, right? Some people translate it as chivalry, right? Its meaning again means a horse rider, right? Again, it's someone who is sort of like a knight. And the idea here is that someone who is powerful and is like a knight has no fear, right? Moves through the world in freedom, right? And so the person who reaches sainthood is one who moves through the world with no fear and has freedom, has true freedom, right? Now, looking at the last days of Malcolm X, when Malcolm X understood that he was walking dead, that everyone around him is telling him, Malcolm, you can live. You can live. You can live. It's simple. For example, come to Africa. Hide out for a year, 2 years. And Malcolm keeps responding, I'm already dead. The day that his house was bombed, he said, I believe my house was bombed to prevent me from speaking in Detroit. And all that has done is simply urge me more to go and speak in Detroit. Right? Urge me more to tell these people, to let them know that Pharaoh has nothing but a veil over our eyes in terms of our humanities, in terms of our capacities, in terms of our potential, in terms of the potential that we can actually have. And don't forget that again, you are living in a moment of tremendous tumultuous, there's war going on. Not only in Africa, not only in Latin America, not only in Asia, but in the streets of the United States. There is in 1968 at least 100 rebellions in the United States throughout cities where people are like, we are fed up with it. And that is his legacy. Those words, that fear of not dying, no fear of dying. I myself can't comprehend that. Right now I cannot comprehend that. We're living in a moment in which post-modernity has something that they call it hermeneutics of suspicion. It's where we have suspicion that everyone is after power. And so we look, for example, at the scholars and we say, what's hiding behind that, right? We see patriarchy hiding behind that. We see economics hiding behind that. We see race hiding behind that. We see all of these hiding behind your pretty words, right? It's called hermeneutics of suspicion. And it's very dangerous. It's a good technique up to a certain degree. But there are certain people that when you look at them, can have no hermeneutics of suspicion, right? This is Malcolm X. This is someone who knew he walked gladly. He smiled towards his death. Plato gets asked, what's the point of life? What's his answer? What's the point of life? He says it's to know how to die. He says everyone is going to die. Everyone is moving towards their death. You are in the process of dying right now. I heard Saad Omar say that, right? And I've heard other people say that. You are in the process of dying right now, right? And Plato says, how will you meet this death? How will you meet it, right? Malcolm X met it like he lived it. Composed, smiling, fearless, self-abnegating, truthfully following the tradition of Futuwa laid down by people like Abu Hafs al-Sohrawardi or Abdullah al-Ansari, where they literally lay out the various states of denying yourself, until in the end, as Abdul Qadir al-Jilani says, you are before Allah as though there is no world. Until in the end, you are before your Lord as though there is no world. Do you not fear dying, Malcolm X? No. I have something to fulfill before my Lord. And you are before the world as though there is no you. You are before the world as though there is no you. This is something I have not realized. This is something I do not know. I can only see it upon others, and when I see it, it's difficult to have suspicion when the person has paid the price. It's definitely difficult to have suspicion when the person has paid the price. And so the few things that I said was, one, let's look at PHARAOH, right? Sherman Jackson says PHARAOH, in this instance, is the logic of white supremacy as a world political structure that has made us hate ourselves, the way that we look, the way that our sisters look. The fountain of knowledge that we had, it makes us think it's not enough. It's insufficient, right? We must be grounded in modern sensibilities. This is what Sherman Jackson calls shirk, that white supremacy shirk, where we begin to think that if we're going to have any real sensibilities, it must be Western sensibilities, right? It must be liberalism. It must taste good to the liberals, right? In order for it to have any of that, right? So who is PHARAOH? That he makes us hate ourselves, that he's put a veil over us, right? Then once we know who PHARAOH is, then we see who Musa alayhi salam was, who made the dua to Allah to have no fear. And Allah says, I will give you that, right? And please, I'm afraid that he will deal with us unjustly, right? Because who is PHARAOH nonetheless? He is the one that every other year kills the firstborn, male. That every other year, right? Ibn Kathir says at the beginning it was every year kill the male, and then I gotta be quiet now, right? Okay, I saw that look. That was the be quiet look.
He's afraid, and that's why.
Of course. I'm sorry about that. And again, who is PHARAOH? Who is Musa? Right? Then we know why is it that we're making this analogy? And the last one, my thought on that indivisible fissure between action and thought, between the heart and the body, right? And that last one is that if we look at our tradition of sainthood in terms of self-abnegation, in terms of, once again, being before your Lord as though there is no world, and being before the world as though there is no God, there is no you, right? That lack of fear, right? That understanding that we are walking dead already. That is Malcolm. That is Malcolm. And I will leave it there, and inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Takbir.
أنت ولينا فاغفر لنا وارحمنا وأنت خير الغافرين واكتب لنا في هذه الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة إنا هدنا إليك. We'll leave it. This is actually I was going to show you that Killer Mike. Does anyone know who Killer Mike is? Okay, yes. So Killer Mike is actually one of the first people that I heard call Malcolm X a saint, right? And so I was going to show you that little moment, right? He says something along the lines of, if God gives you a load, you got to carry it like Mary did. That's why I'm giving honor to all the babies' mamas. It takes a mother's womb to make a Christ or Dalai Lama. The world will take a child and turn him into a monster, and God will take the monster and fashion him a saint. I present you Malcolm X for those who are saying that he can't, saying that he won't, when I know he will. We only tend to notice you when you're being killed. And so, right? And so the beautiful thing about that is that he says, I present you Malcolm X, right? But however, for those who say that God will not bring a saint, when I know He will. Meaning, it's continuous. Meaning, Malcolm X was one ripple from amongst a legacy of sainthood and struggle that is all around us. So that's what I wanted to share. Jazakallah.
Alright, we'll be breaking for Maghrib, so we'll just head straight down to the Salah. If you need to make wudu, you can go ahead and make wudu. Everyone knows where bathrooms are? Anyone has any questions, let us know. We're going to, after Maghrib, we're going to be having dinner.